that evidence. And yet you have now the modern spectacle of Tibetan Buddhists, rather than becoming suicide bombers, they're practicing self-immolation in response to the actions of China. And it seems to me, there's not really deep scholarship at the bottom of this. I have more experience of Tibetan Buddhism, but insofar as I know Zen as well, you can read for a very long time in the Zen literature and not find any emphasis on compassion and sila, ethics. To the contrary, you can find many analogies that seem to give a kind of martial ethic. The sword of wisdom, kind of a samurai ethic, comes to the fore often in Zen parables. So it's actually not a surprise to me that Zen, under a certain construal, could have helped animate the kamikaze phenomenon. And it's also not a surprise to me that Vajrayana Buddhists are self-immolating as opposed to becoming suicide bombers, given the emphasis on compassion in that context.
I think I have to disagree with you.
But I should also say that it also doesn't seem impossible to me that you could get a martial and aggressive form of Tibetan Buddhism, because there's certainly a martial history within Tibet, and it's not a pacifistic religion. So it's not that it's impossible, but it seems to me less likely than in Zen.
First, I totally agree with you in terms of the importance of emphasizing from the very beginning, a spiritual path or a meditative path, the importance of a foundation of sila, of non-harming. I could say that gets programmed in from the very beginning, and it becomes a reference point for really highlighting when our actions are becoming harmful. Just as the simplest example, but this could be elaborated a lot. But just the basic precept about not lying. If one has repeatedly taken the precepts with commitment, not killing, not stealing, not saying that which is untrue, not committing sexual misconduct, just the basic lay precepts for living in the world in a non-harming way. What I found is, from having taken the precepts and reflected on them, so often, if there's a thought in the mind or about to say something that which is untrue, having taken the precept, it acts like a little mindfulness bell. It says, oh, this is not true. And very often that's enough. That brings enough mindfulness to enable me to, no. So I'm not going to say that. I'm going to refrain from doing that. So having, laying the foundation of the precepts in whatever form, people understand them, and reflecting on them and really making it part of the practice, I think has a tremendous effect, on the way we live our lives.
I think with lying, for me, and obviously I've thought a lot about this and wrote a short book on it, it's not a matter of having taken the precepts, it's a matter of having become attentive enough to the consequences of lying, both in my life and the lives of others, to have a very visceral sense of that's no place worth going. The pain that accrues, and also just the sense of divisiveness that it arises out of. So if we're having a conversation and I feel the impulse to lie to you, and so already there's something wrong in the relationship. The suffering inherent to the whole project of misrepresenting things so as to mislead you, and hopefully not get caught in the future, the thing is so viscerally toxic to me that's what sets off the mindfulness alarm.
But you've given a lot of thought and attention to this. So I think for many people, a first step in coming to that understanding is having learned about the precepts, having taken to them.
The abstract wrongfulness of it.
Yeah, and then that triggers a greater mindfulness of everything you're saying. But I think many people are not necessarily have that level of awareness of the consequences or how it feels right from the beginning. Yeah, so I see that as just being a spectrum of depth of understanding. Okay, all of that being said, I think that in every spiritual tradition, whether the precepts have been highly emphasized or not. Given certain conditions, the unenlightened human mind is going to engage in some pretty harmful actions. So whether it's the kamikaze pilots in World War II, whether in the long history in Tibetan Buddhism, not just the self-immolation with respect to the protesting the Chinese, but just the history of Tibet, of the great monastic traditions, fighting each other and killing each other.
They had a Middle Ages like everything else, yeah.
And we see it in Burma now, with many, both of the politicians, but also of many of the monastics with the Rohingya, and the tremendous violence and hatred.
There's a crucial difference for me there, where obviously it's horrendous violence and worthy of condemning, like any other violence, but it's important to see that there is certainly no clear, and I think probably just not any, justification within the teachings of Theravada Buddhism for that behavior. These monks can't point to the suttas where the Buddha said, my followers, until you eradicate these Muslim beasts, there'll be no peace for you on this earth, right? Now, if there was a sutta like that would be more problematic. Then they would be able to say, this is not only justified, this is a sacred obligation of ours to behave this way. Now, the problem with Zen, have you looked at those books, Zen at War or Zen War Stories?
I'm familiar with them.
Because there are passages that you could sort of see how the wrong Zen master could rally the troops with genuine Zen teaching. It's harder in Theravada Buddhism to do that. Now, that's not to say that you can't get Theravada Buddhists, as you point out, it's happening in Burma, who are behaving like murderous psychopaths on the basis of very ordinary tribalism. But it's always worse to have ordinary tribalism, xenophobia, racism, in-group, out-group thinking, potentiated by a doctrine that people think is either handed down from the creator of the universe or revealed from the enlightened mind of the greatest spiritual adept anyone ever paid attention to.
I don't disagree with you, and I know this is your particular...
You're in my wheelhouse now, Joseph.
my only point was that...
But you seem to be disputing any kind of gradations of emphasis on sila that I think I was noticing in the Buddhist tradition that explains maybe why we're not seeing Tibetan Buddhist kamikazes, and we did see Zen kamikaze. It just seems like an accident of history more than any difference in the teaching. Are you saying Zen emphasizes compassion as much as the other traditions of Buddhism? Because if so, I haven't seen that.
I don't really know enough about Zen culture in Japan to know the place, that compassion plays. I mean, I am familiar, with Kuan Yin being a major part of that tradition. I'm not engaging in the conversation on the level of, okay, which are the contributing forces which make things worse or better? It probably is worse if things are contained right in the scriptures that justify immoral behavior. I'm just looking at whatever the conditions are, whether it's because there's something in the tradition or it's because of the defilements that are still remaining in the mind. And given certain situations, they're going to come up regardless of whether the tradition emphasizes sila or doesn't emphasize sila.
We are talking about people behaving as people.
Yes.
These people are apes with various degrees of psychological unhealth. So however much they're practicing or not, you're going to get all of the aberrant behavior of unhappy apes most of the time.
And so we've really wandered, I think, quite far from...
Well, no, it's on point. Insofar as sila, that is ethics, is important, the degree to which it's kept in view in any
Yes.
tradition, or
Yes.
emphasized in any
Yes.
tradition, or spelled out,
Yes, it's
it
helpful.
matters.
Yes.
Whether you're going to grant that this is true of Zen or any other tradition within Buddhism or not, we could invent a tradition right now. We could start our own cult that didn't emphasize ethics at all, but gave all the full
Yes,
armamentarium of esoteric, attentional practices of meditation, and you could teach mindfulness, but you could either never talk about ethic or explicitly deny anything useful there. You could say, oh no, it doesn't matter how you behave. It just matters whether you're mindful. So
Well,
rape and pillage and...
No, see, but I think it's not that I disagree with you. I'm totally in agreement about the
Then why do you sound so dissatisfied?
the importance of Sila, and we talk about it a lot, and it's something of beauty in one's life, so it's a tremendously powerful strength. I guess the slight, it's not a disagreement, but a shift of emphasis. You're contrasting that to a system, as you described, of where you're just being mindful without any reference to Sila and the deficit of that. I think you're giving pride of place to mindfulness rather than to wisdom. Mindfulness is in the service of wisdom. Mindfulness is not an end in itself. The bigger question is, what do we learn from being mindful? Because as the language you used, mindfulness as a training in attention. Okay, so that's really important. But once we're paying attention, what are we learning? So the wisdom component, which ultimately leads to the uprooting of those defilements in the mind, which cause all the harmful actions you mentioned. So why do people behave badly in all these various ways? Because of greed in the mind, because of anger, because of fear, because of hatred. As long as those are still in the mind, they are going to find expression. My understanding and limited experience in walking along the path, that different of these defilements actually get weakened and finally uprooted through wisdom. That's the key point where Sila and the mindfulness wisdom spectrum come together.
That does take us back to our last conversation with this model of uprooting and the stages of insight. But whether or not that's true, most of us are in the position of having what you're calling the defilements not decisively uprooted. They're going to continue to arise, as we spoke of before. So negative mind states will continue to arise, fear and anger and desire. And I think there's a separate conversation to be had about just whether those mind states are in fact intrinsically negative, and what is someone like a Buddha really without fear, desire, anger, or are there sort of enlightened analogs of all of those states of mind, or an enlightened relationship to those states of mind. So just how unrecognizable is the experience of a quote enlightened master? That's another question. But leaving that aside, given the situation that most of us are in, which is the greatest hits are still going to be playing, then the question is, how long do they play for, and what are the consequences of their playing, given whatever quality of attention you can bring in the present moment? And they are having some kind of conceptual framework that sets the bounds of reasonable behavior, ethically speaking, is incredibly important.
Completely important. Yeah, and I think it's really worth bringing that teaching, to the forefront as being the framework and the foundation, not only kind of as a protection against excessively harmful actions, but it's also directly related to the ability to develop mindfulness and concentration. Because when we do unskillful actions and then we're meditating, it's very common experience is that these come to mind. We start remembering them, often with qualities of remorse, of feeling badly about having done something that was harmful. or unskillful. And if we are continually doing those actions, the mind is in a very unsettled state, and it's very difficult then for the mind to settle, become concentrated, become more mindful, and experience the deeper places of meditation. So there's a direct link between sila and the ability to enter into meditative states.
That's always what's emphasized in the teaching, that if you have a disordered life where you're behaving unethically, you're not going to be able to concentrate effectively in any kind of meditative practice. I guess I'm somewhat agnostic as to whether or not that's always true, but I can see why one thinks it would be true.
Even if it's not always true, it's often true.
Yeah. I still think of Muktananda.
Yeah, so
the existence proof of spiritual athlete and something approaching the psychopath, although I guess you could discount slightly for different cultural expectations. There's another question here from Krishan Bhattacharya. You never got around to explaining emptiness last time. You said you would, but you're getting sidetracked. Leave it to us to talk for 2.5 hours about emptiness without ever explaining it. You want to take that?
I give a talk explaining some ways of experiencing emptiness, in our life and in our practice. So this will just be a brief summary of that. So I think the most ordinary experience of emptiness, which we've all felt at different times, could be understood as a lack of self-centeredness. And usually we think of self-centeredness as being a kind of personality problem. If somebody's self-centered, our friends might suggest going to a therapist to become a little less so. But it actually has, a more profound meaning. To be less self-centered, or to have an absence of self-centeredness, means that instead of having the notion or idea of self as being a central point around which our lives revolve, as they almost always do for most people. We're caught up in our wants and our desires and our fears and our hopes and anticipations, all revolving around a sense of self. As we practice, we move into what I call the Dharma realm of experience, which revolves around what I sometimes refer to as the zero center of emptiness. Instead of things revolving around the sense of self, as we become less self-centered in that way, we begin to see that our lives is the unfolding of the Dharma. Then the zero center of emptiness becomes the reference point for our lives.
So how would you distinguish or not the concepts of selflessness and emptiness?
In this particular framework, they're synonymous. And I once asked Sayadaw U Pandita, one of my Burmese teachers, in Pali, the word for selflessness is anatta and emptiness is shunyata. And I asked him what the difference was, and
he said, don't trouble your pretty little head about it.
No, he actually said, at least from his understanding, that they were the same. So, which surprised me in a way. So there's one way of understanding emptiness to mean that. So another way we experience emptiness, again, and this is kind of in a mundane way, but we get a flavor of it, is when, sometimes we just find ourselves in a state of flow where things are happening really without any effort. And sometimes it might be in music or sports or some creativity, or when we're in the zone and things are just happening, there doesn't seem to be a sense of self involved, and generally things are happening much better for it, because the self, the I, is out of the way. And so that's just another flavor. We can get a flavor of emptiness, lack of self-centeredness in that regard. Another way we can experience it sometimes is when we're with great teachers who really seem to be very selfless, empty of self. I've seen this with various of my teachers. One particular situation comes to mind when our teacher Deepama, this wonderful woman, amazing yogi, reached high levels of realization and full of metta and compassion, and very empty. One time she was in the meditation hall in Bari, in our center, and I just happened to notice when she came in and she bowed to the Buddha, and it was so striking to me that she's so embodied the teachings. It was like emptiness bowing to emptiness, or love bowing to love. It felt like there was no one there. So sometimes we can intuit just from some very great beings. There's another whole level of understanding emptiness, and this comes from some of the other traditions. It's not so much emphasizing the selfless nature, emptiness of self in the way that I've been describing, but the empty nature of the mind itself. And so, for example, in many Tibetan or Zen teachings, in one way or another, the instruction will be look for the mind. Can you find the mind? And in that instruction, you're actually looking for the mind. In that way, there can be the experience of nothing to find. And as Tulku Organ would often say, the not finding is the finding. That's what's to be found, that there is nothing to find. And so that can be a direct experience of the empty nature of the mind. There's nothing to find. And yet knowing awareness is still there. There's a very famous Zen dialogue, which I've actually used a lot in my practice. It was when Bodhidharma was, had brought the teachings to China. But before he started teaching, he was just sitting in this cave, as it said, for 9 years. And then this one follower comes to him, please teach me. He had to prove, the disciple had to prove his mettle. But finally, Bodhidharma comes out of his cave, and the disciple says, I'm suffering so much, please pacify my mind. And Bodhidharma says to him, show me your mind and I'll pacify it. And the disciple says, I've looked for it everywhere and I can't find it. And then Bodhidharma says, there, it's already pacified. And it's very interesting I'll often tell this story, on retreats, and very often people hear it, and then when they hear the punchline, there, it's already pacified, people will laugh, because it's kind of a Zen witticism. I've looked for the mind, I can't find it. There, it's already pacified. Missing the fact that there's a profound teaching there.
Those are your future kamikaze pilots. Train those boys up.
And I'll often use that very dialogue. I maybe just engage in my life, taking a walk or something, and ruminating about some difficulty or whatever. And if I see that my mind is caught up in some kind of suffering, and because I'm very familiar with that little dialogue, all I need to say to myself is, already pacified. It's the reminder that the mind is empty in this way, there's nothing to find. And it's amazing, just in that remembrance, that recollection in that moment, the mind is already pacified.
Yeah.
So all of these, this is like a smorgasbord.
Although that last one, at least to my ear or in my experience, seems to also focus on anatta or selflessness, because when you're looking for the mind, you're looking for the thinker, and you're not finding a thinker. You're finding the next thought arising or not. Where does it go? There's nothing to see, and the lack of structure in consciousness around this phenomenon we're calling mind is what jumps to the fore, and the self seems to imply a structure.
Yes.
I guess what this questioner may be also wondering about is the larger teachings on emptiness within Buddhism, certainly in a tradition like Madhyamaka, where they're talking not just about the quality of our minds, but about just the nature of reality.
Yes.
Either based on the interdependence of everything, where any concept you'd apply to a specific thing under analysis begins to erode, and you can't find that thing. There's a famous dialogue in the Pali Canon around, I guess, the questions of King Milinda, where he's asking where the chariot is, and I forget who it is. It's not the Buddha. It's somebody.
Nagasena.
Nagasena, yeah. Says, is it in the wheels? Is it in the stirrup? Is it in the pointing to the various parts of the chariot? Although a stirrup undoubtedly is not part of a chariot. But is it in any of one of these pieces? And clearly it's not. If you take all the pieces apart, there's no chariot to be found, and chariotness isn't in any one of the pieces. And so it's the concept of chariot is applied to a constellation of chariot parts, no one of which is a chariot. And so this interdependent arising of any phenomenon, obviously this consideration can be pointed inward. So you look at anger, say, where is anger? Is anger that feeling of energy in your face? Is it the feeling in your chest? Is it the thought of the person you're angry at arising and passing away? No one of these things is anger, and yet anger is this name we give to a constellation of mental phenomenon.
I think there's a point here which might be worth illuminating, which is about the union of appearance and emptiness. And so the example that's often used and I like a lot is, and it's related to your example of the chariot, is that of a rainbow. After rain, the sun comes out and we see a rainbow, and it's really beautiful, and there's often a nice, delighted feeling in us. But when we look more carefully, we see, is there anything which is a rainbow? And when we analyze it, in a careful way, we see there's no rainbow apart from, just as you mentioned with the chariot, there's water and air and light, and the conditions come together in a certain way. And so there's an appearance of a rainbow. So what's interesting is not to deny the level of appearance, right? The appearance is there and we experience it. And yet the rainbow is just a designation for an appearance. It's not a designation for something that is there in itself. And so that's another understanding of emptiness. Just in this regard, there was one little exchange with a Tibetan teacher when somebody asked him, is the self real? And his response was, yes, it's real, but it's not really real. You exaggerate it. And I love that, because on one level, the self is there's an appearance of a self, of Sam and Joseph and everybody else. But when we look more carefully, it is just an appearance of conditions coming together. And so in that case, that's a different self than the self I'm recommending and you're recommending that someone lose in the insight of anatta. I would say that's referring to the person. A person is like a chariot. You point to person parts. Or a human mind. The mind clearly exists. People clearly exist. And yet they're designated upon processes and parts that are, once you separate them, then there is in some paradoxical sense nothing to find. But the self that is an illusion that can be cut through, that's an illusion in a different sense. That is something that you can not find, and still all of the phenomenology of having a mind and being a person and being in a world with chariots and rainbows, all of that is still present, and yet the implied center in consciousness can drop away. So that's one point, that there's gradations to this illusion. Another thing I'd put in this category is free will. Free will is a misconceived notion about the way the world works. It's not like a chariot or a rainbow. It's actually not there. Right? The self is like that. The self that is the atta that anatta cancels is like that. That doesn't cancel the human mind, doesn't cancel the phenomenon